She said nothing for years, but now the truth is out, and it's worse than anyone imagined. Millions of dollars tied to Daystar are missing, and all eyes are on Joni Lamb. Behind the polished sermons and smiling cameras was a secret unraveling. Where did the money go? Who knew what? And when? The silence is finally broken, and what's been revealed is shaking the foundation of one of the biggest Christian networks in the world. This scandal isn't just big, it's explosive. It didn't start with a headline. It didn't begin with a lawsuit or a media leak. It started with a quiet moment in a private room, during what was supposed to be a normal board meeting. 3 people sat together. Joni Lamb, her longtime friend and advisor Tom Callender, and her son, Jonathan Lamb. These were people who had known each other for decades. Family, friends, trusted leaders of one of the most powerful Christian media networks in the world. No one expected what would happen next. The meeting wasn't tense at first. It was just another day in the inner circle of Daystar's leadership. But everything shifted when Jonathan, calm and collected, asked a single question that cracked open a secret no one else seemed willing to confront. He looked at his mother and said, "Mom, did you really use $100,000, 0 cents of Daystar money for your honeymoon?" Just like that, the room changed. The air got heavier, and everything that had been hidden for years began to unravel. Jonathan wasn't trying to make a scene. He wasn't angry or shouting. He was doing what anyone with a conscience would do, asking about something that didn't sit right. His mother, Joni Lamb, had recently married Dr. Doug Weiss. They'd taken a lavish honeymoon, and whispers were already spreading about how it was paid for. Jonathan had seen the numbers. He had heard the rumors. And now he wanted the truth straight from the source. The answer didn't come with an apology or even a real explanation. What came next was worse. Tom, sitting right there beside Joni, casually said, "We'll just gift it to her." Like it was no big deal. Like using ministry money, donor money for a personal luxury trip, was something they could just brush off with a label. No vote, no accountability, no discussion about whether it was right or wrong, just a shrug and a decision behind closed doors. Jonathan was stunned, and that moment stayed with him. He didn't react right away. He didn't storm out of the room. But something inside him changed. He sat with it. He prayed about it. He thought about all the people who gave money to Daystar out of faith, some donating their last dollars, believing they were supporting God's work. And he knew what he had witnessed wasn't right. It didn't matter that it was his own mother. It didn't matter that Tom was like family. This was wrong. That meeting planted a seed that would grow into a full-blown scandal. Jonathan started quietly telling people he trusted. He didn't rush to the press. He didn't go public with rage. He simply couldn't ignore what he had seen. And the more people found out, the more the story began to grow. Eventually, the truth made its way into the public eye, and when it did, it exploded. For supporters of Daystar, this wasn't just about a $100,000 0 cents trip. It was about trust. It was about the belief that their donations were going to support ministry, not luxury. And it all started because one person, someone inside the family, asked one honest question. That moment in the boardroom became the spark. A simple, quiet moment that exposed something much deeper. And once the truth started coming out, there was no going back. The scandal didn't explode all at once. At first, it moved quietly, like a slow leak. Jonathan Lamb, after asking his mother that one crucial question about the $100,000, 0 cents being used for her honeymoon, didn't run to the press. He didn't want to start a war. He didn't want to destroy his family or the ministry they had spent decades building. He simply wanted answers. And when the answers didn't come or came in the form of half-hearted explanations, he knew something had to be done. He began telling people behind the scenes, trusted voices, leaders, people who would understand the weight of what he had witnessed. But the reaction was silence, awkward silence, the kind of silence that feels like a wall going up. People didn't know what to say. Some wanted to protect Joni. Some didn't want to believe it. Others were afraid to get involved. The truth was heavy, and not everyone had the strength or the courage to carry it. When the whispers eventually turned into news, everything changed. The story came out that Joni Lamb had allegedly used ministry money for her luxury honeymoon, and when questioned, her inner circle had tried to cover it up by calling it a gift. The public was stunned. For years, Joni had been a trusted figure in Christian households. People had cried during her broadcasts. They had sent in prayer requests, tithed faithfully, believed deeply in the work Daystar was doing. And now, it all felt like a lie. Still, there was no press conference, no sit-down interview, no open apology. Nothing. Just more silence. And for supporters, that was the moment everything broke. Because this wasn't just about the money anymore. It became something deeper. It became about trust. And when trust breaks, it's not like a window that cracks. It's like a mirror that shatters. It's hard to put back together, and even when you do, the reflection is never the same. Joni did eventually respond, but only after the pressure had built too high to ignore. She said she had paid the money back. She claimed it was a misunderstanding. But the public noticed the timing. The money wasn't returned until after Jonathan raised concerns, after people began digging, after eyes were finally on the books. And that raised more questions than it answered. Would she have returned the money if no one ever found out? If Jonathan hadn't spoken up, would anyone have known the truth? That's what made it feel like betrayal. Not just the spending, but the cover-up, the brushing off, the lack of urgency to correct what was clearly a serious breach of trust. And while many ministries would have used a moment like that to show humility, to hold a public meeting, to bring in outside audits and make real changes, Daystar did none of that. Instead, they tried to carry on as if nothing happened, business as usual. But it wasn't usual, not anymore. Supporters began speaking out, former donors went online. YouTube videos popped up with titles like, "I Trusted Her," "Heartbroken by Daystar," and "Is This What My Tithes Paid For?" These weren't critics or trolls. These were longtime viewers, people who had supported Daystar for decades, people who had prayed along with Joni during hard times and had sent in their last $20 or cents because they believed they were supporting the work of God. One woman wrote on Facebook, "It's not just the money, it's the silence. That hurts more than anything." Another said, "I didn't expect perfection. I expected honesty. I gave because I trusted her." The silence felt loud, deafening. And it didn't just come from Joni. It came from the whole ministry. There were no visible changes, no transparency, no documents shared to prove the money had been repaid, no apology tour, no moment of vulnerability, just a quiet return to normal programming, as if nothing had happened. And that choice, to say nothing, did more damage than the scandal itself. Because when people give to a ministry, they're not just giving money, they're giving trust. And when that trust is broken, it leaves a scar. For some, it's the kind of wound that makes them stop giving altogether, not just to Daystar, but to any ministry. They begin to question all of it, the sermons, the promises, the people behind the cameras, what was real, and what was just performance. It didn't help that Daystar, legally classified as a church, wasn't required to release public financial reports. There were no 990 forms, no third-party audits, no way for donors to truly see how their money was being spent. And while that had always been the case, most people didn't know. They had no idea how little oversight there was, how much freedom the leadership had to do what they wanted with millions of dollars. The scandal revealed more than just one misuse of funds. It exposed a system built to avoid transparency. A structure where decisions about massive amounts of money were made by a very small group of people, often without any checks or balances. And at the center of it was Joni Lamb, smiling on camera, holding a Bible, and continuing her broadcasts as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Donations began to slow, viewership dropped. Some pastors who had once partnered with Daystar quietly distanced themselves. Others spoke out publicly, calling for greater accountability in all Christian media. The ripple effect had begun. Because the story wasn't just about one network anymore. It was about what happens when faith, power, and money mix without oversight. Jonathan Lamb, in all of this, became the reluctant whistleblower, the son who had the courage to speak up when no one else would. He wasn't trying to bring down his family. He wasn't looking for revenge. He was just trying to do the right thing. And for many people, he became the only trustworthy voice in the story. The ministry's response, or lack of one, only made him look more honorable in the eyes of the public. He didn't drag it out on social media. He didn't hold a press tour. He simply raised a concern and stood by it, even when it cost him. And that's what hurt the most for people watching from the outside, that a man who had grown up in the ministry, who loved his family, who had believed in the mission, felt he had no choice but to speak out. And instead of his concerns being met with accountability and grace, they were met with silence. A silence that still hasn't been fully broken. Years of loyalty, years of giving, years of believing, all chipped away in the aftermath of that silence. Some supporters still haven't returned. Some never will. Because this wasn't just a public relations issue. This was a spiritual wound. And until someone stands up and fully owns it, that wound will remain open. What began as one question became a scandal. What became a scandal became a crisis of trust. And what Daystar chose to do in response? Spin the story, deny wrongdoing, stay silent, only made that crisis deeper. People are still waiting for someone to say what needs to be said. We were wrong, we failed, and we're sorry. But until that day comes, the silence speaks louder than words ever could. Daystar wasn't just a television network. On paper, it was a church. That one word, church, changed everything. It gave them a kind of legal shield that most people didn't know about. And for years, that status allowed them to operate behind closed doors, with very little oversight and almost no financial transparency. But when the scandal around Joni Lamb broke, people started digging. And what they found shocked them, because Daystar didn't look like any church they'd ever seen. There were no regular Sunday services, no congregations sitting in pews, no weekly sermons in a local chapel. Instead, there were sound stages, cameras, production teams, corporate offices, and million-dollar sets. It looked and operated like a media company, but legally, it was protected like a church. That legal classification meant that Daystar didn't have to file the same financial disclosures that other nonprofits did. While charities are required to file 990 forms with the IRS every year showing how much money they bring in, where it goes, who gets paid, churches are not. And Daystar took full advantage of that. For decades, millions of dollars flowed through the ministry. Donors gave generously, believing they were supporting evangelism, missions, and gospel work. Some gave sacrificially. Widows on fixed incomes, single parents, young couples just starting out. They trusted Daystar, they believed in the mission. They thought they were part of something eternal. But behind the scenes, there was no open book, no third-party audits, no financial reports available to the public. People were giving blindly, with no way to confirm where their money actually went. When the honeymoon scandal came to light, when Joni Lamb was accused of using $100,000, 0 cents, in ministry funds for a luxury vacation with her new husband, people were stunned. But what made it worse was realizing that this could happen without anyone knowing, and not just once. The system was built in a way that allowed it to happen over and over again. There was no real board of oversight, no finance committee made up of outside voices, just Joni, her close friend Tom, and her son Jonathan. 3 people making all the major financial decisions for a multi-million-dollar religious organization. That's not a church. That's a private business operating under religious protection. The IRS doesn't require churches to explain how money is spent, and so Daystar never did. They didn't have to tell donors how much was going to salaries. They didn't have to report how much was being spent on travel, luxury items, or personal expenses. They didn't even have to disclose how much was going to actual ministry work. Everything stayed internal, tightly controlled by a small inner circle, and most viewers never questioned it. Why would they? Daystar looked legitimate. The broadcasts were polished. The studio lights sparkled. The music was moving. And Joni, with her soft voice and calming presence, felt like a trusted, spiritual leader. People cried with her, prayed with her, believed in her. She called Daystar a church, and so they accepted it. But as more details came out, that illusion began to fall apart. It wasn't just about one bad decision or one questionable expense. It was about the entire structure. The truth is, Daystar wasn't built like a church. It wasn't accountable like a church. It didn't serve people in the traditional sense of ministry. It served an audience, a viewer base. It was more about broadcasting than pastoring. And that's not inherently wrong. Christian media can do amazing work, but calling it a church while avoiding all the responsibilities of one? That's where the problem begins. Because when people give to a church, they expect some basic values: transparency, integrity, spiritual leadership. They don't expect their tithes to fund luxury vacations or designer wardrobes. They don't expect leadership to operate in secret. And they certainly don't expect to be left in the dark when serious accusations come to light. But that's exactly what happened. The system allowed it. It was never designed for accountability. It was designed for control, and for years, Joni had that control. She could approve spending, write checks, sign deals, and no one outside the tight inner circle could challenge her. That's how $100,000, 0 cents, could be spent on a honeymoon without a single formal vote. That's how donor money could be used in ways the donors would never have agreed to and never even know about. People started looking at Daystar differently. They began to ask the hard questions. Where did all the money go? How much was spent on actual ministry? How much went to salaries, perks, travel? How many other expenses were quietly labeled gifts to avoid scrutiny? And why was no one stopping it? The sad truth is, no one could. Not because they didn't want to, but because the system didn't allow it. There was no requirement to open the books, no government agency regularly checking, no financial transparency laws that applied. As long as Daystar called itself a church, it was protected. And that protection created the perfect environment for misuse. Of course, not every church misuses funds. Most operate with deep integrity and care. But the loophole exists. And Daystar's situation brought that loophole into the spotlight. Christian watchdog groups took notice. They began sounding the alarm, not just about Daystar, but about the entire way religious organizations are shielded from financial accountability in the U.S. Even some longtime donors, who had supported ministries for decades, began questioning where their money had gone. The honeymoon scandal was just the match, but the fire had been building for years. People felt betrayed, not just by Joni, but by the system that allowed it all to stay hidden. They had given money in good faith, prayed in good faith, trusted in good faith, and now they felt foolish, used, lied to. And Joni, she kept smiling on camera. She kept hosting shows. There was no deep reckoning, no televised apology, no call for reform. Just a quiet statement that the money had been paid back and a return to normalcy. But things weren't normal anymore. The damage had been done. The illusion had been shattered. And Daystar, this so-called church, was now seen by many as something entirely different. A brand, a business, a media empire, wearing a spiritual mask. The heartbreaking part is that so many people truly believed. They weren't donating to a company. They were giving to God. At least, that's what they thought. And when the truth started coming out, it wasn't just disappointing, it was spiritually devastating. Because when a ministry fails you, it doesn't just cost you money, it shakes your faith. And that's what makes this system so dangerous. The lack of accountability doesn't just open the door to financial abuse, it opens the door to spiritual harm. People started walking away. From Daystar, from giving, from ministries altogether. Not because they stopped believing in God, but because they no longer believed in the people who said they represented Him. That's what happens when a church exists in name only, when the mission becomes secondary to the money. When leadership forgets who they serve, it stops being a church and becomes something else entirely, and that's what Daystar had become, whether they ever meant for it or not. A church in name, a business in practice, a system built to hide and protect the truth. Until one voice, one question, cracked it open, and once the light got in, nothing looked the same again. After the scandal around Joni Lamb and Daystar broke, the damage didn't stop at just headlines. It left a mark. On the ministry, on the people who gave their hearts and money to it, and on the wider world of Christian broadcasting. What started as a quiet question in a boardroom soon became a national story. And once the truth started coming out, it couldn't be stuffed back into the shadows. The aftermath was messy, emotional, and in many ways, just the beginning. For a lot of longtime viewers, the biggest wound wasn't financial, it was emotional. They had trusted Daystar for years. They watched the shows, sent in their donations, and believed they were part of something meaningful. But now, they were left questioning everything. Some felt betrayed, others felt foolish. A few were simply heartbroken. The person they had come to admire, to look to for spiritual strength, had used ministry money for personal luxury, and then said almost nothing about it. The silence from Daystar leadership only made things worse. There was no press conference, no deep apology, no admission of wrongdoing, just a vague statement about the money being paid back and business going on as usual. But for many, it wasn't usual anymore. The trust had been broken. And when trust is broken in a spiritual setting, it hits harder than in any business deal. Some people stopped giving to Daystar entirely. Others pulled support from Christian media ministries altogether. Smaller churches that had once aired Daystar content quietly took it down. Donors began asking more questions, not just to Daystar, but to every ministry they supported. Where is my money going? Who is watching the books? Is anyone really being held accountable? That ripple effect started to grow. What happened with Daystar sparked a larger conversation, one that had been quietly brewing in corners of the Christian community for years, but now was unavoidable. People were asking whether ministries, especially those registered as churches, should be allowed to operate without financial transparency. After all, most nonprofits have to file public reports showing where money is going, but churches don't. That's the law.